They had a word for women like me. They wrote it in their ledgers and spoke it at their dinner tables, and used it in their negotiations the way a horse trader uses the word sound or a cotton factor uses the word grade. The word was breeder. It appeared in advertisements in the Natchez and Vicksburg papers between the listings for mules and the listings for tools. It appeared in private letters between planters discussing the relative merits of their human property. And it appeared, 11 times over 6 years, in the plantation ledger of the Calverton estate in Adams County, Mississippi, beside my name, each entry a notation of value that increased with each child I bore, as if I were livestock whose worth could be calculated from the evidence of successful reproduction. My name is Aminta. I am 60 years old. I was born enslaved on the Calverton plantation in 1828, and by the time I was 24 years old, I had borne 5 children and had become, in the specific commercial language of Adams County, Mississippi, in 1852, one of the most valuable pieces of property that Master Edward Calverton owned. I am going to tell you what that meant in plain terms, because the plain terms are worse than anything that needs embellishment, and I am going to tell you what I did about it, because what I did about it is the part of this story that the men who wrote those ledger entries never understood and never could have understood, because understanding it would have required them to imagine that the women whose value they were calculating something themselves. I learned to read when I was 9 years old, taught in secret by an enslaved woman named Phyllis, who worked in the Calverton main house. Phyllis had been taught decades earlier by a sympathetic mistress on a different plantation, before that mistress died, and the practice that had produced Phyllis's literacy became, under new ownership, something that could not be acknowledged to exist. Phyllis kept the knowledge anyway, and over the years she passed it carefully, one person at a time, to people she trusted with the kind of trust that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. I was 9 when she chose me. I do not know exactly why she chose me over other children she might have chosen. When I asked her once, years later, she said only that she had watched me for a long time before she decided that she had been looking for something specific in how a child paid attention to things, and that she had seen it in me before I knew there was anything to see. She taught me in the hour before dawn, 3 mornings a week, in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, using a primer that had been hidden inside a hollowed-out section of a wooden beam for longer than either of us had been alive. The primer had passed through at least 2 other people before it reached Phyllis, each of them adding their own marks to its margins, small notes in different hands, a kind of accumulated record of everyone who had ever learned from it. I added my own marks eventually. I do not know if anyone ever read them after me. By the time I was 20, I could read anything that came through the Calverton house. Newspapers when I could find a few minutes alone with one. Letters, glimpsed on a desk or a table, read in the seconds available while dusting or cleaning. Account books on the rare occasions I had access to them, and I had learned through years of careful observation that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with simply paying attention to the world around me with more care than anyone expected a person in my position to pay, exactly how the plantation's record-keeping worked, who maintained which documents, where they were kept, how closely anyone actually checked them against the reality they were supposed to represent, and most importantly, who among the people who handled those records might, if approached carefully enough and trusted slowly enough, be willing to do something with that knowledge other than simply keep it to themselves. This is the foundation of everything that follows, not anything supernatural, not anything that required more than what I have just described. A woman who could read, a system that depended on records, and the gap which existed in every such system everywhere, between what a record says and what is actually true, a gap that someone with access and patience and a reason urgent enough could, very carefully, over a very long time, learn to live inside. I want to describe the system itself before I describe what I did with my understanding of it, because the system is the actual subject of this story, and I will not let it disappear behind anything else, including behind the part of the story that might feel to someone hearing it more like a story and less like an indictment. The Calverton plantation kept what Master Edward called the increase ledger. It was a separate book from the general plantation accounts, kept in his own study in a locked drawer of his desk, though the lock was old and the key was kept in a place that was not as secret as Master Edward believed. The ledger recorded the reproductive history of every enslaved woman on the property who had borne children. Names, dates of births, notes on the health and apparent constitution of both mother and children at birth and in the months following. And running alongside all of this, a calculation updated periodically of how each birth affected the woman's overall valuation, because in Mississippi in the 1850s, an enslaved woman's price at sale was directly and substantially affected by her documented history of bearing children who survived infancy. And a woman with what the trade called a proven record commanded a price significantly higher than a woman without one, sometimes by a margin that exceeded what her labor alone would have been worth by a considerable amount. I was entered in that ledger at age 16 when I bore my first child, a daughter named Ruth. The entry recorded the birth, noted that both mother and child appeared healthy, and adjusted my valuation upward by a specific figure that I saw written in Master Edward's own hand the first time, before the entries began to be made by someone else. Over the following 8 years, 4 more children followed. Each birth produced another entry, another adjustment, another step upward in the number that represented what I was worth, a number that by 1852 had reached a level I understood, from pieces of conversation overheard and assembled over years, was considered, among the planters of Adams County, to be exceptional. I first saw the full ledger, not just the entries about myself, but the entries about every woman on the property at age 18. Master Edward had left his study unlocked during a brief absence, an oversight that I do not believe occurred more than a handful of times in all the years I knew him, and I was alone in the room for the length of time it took to dust the shelves. I opened the book because I had learned to read, and the book was right there, and I had wanted for years to know exactly what was written about me, and this was the only opportunity I had ever had or expected to have. What was written about me was a number, and the number was increasing. And reading it, I understood exactly what the increasing number meant for my future and the futures of my children, because I had seen, over the years, what happened to women whose numbers reached certain thresholds. They were sold, not because anything had gone wrong, not as punishment, not for any reason that had anything to do with their behavior or their conduct. They were sold because the number had become large enough that selling them produced more value for Master Edward than continuing to own them did, particularly when a buyer could be found who specifically wanted what the ledger documented, and such buyers existed, and Master Edward maintained correspondence with several of them. There was a category of buyer in Mississippi and Louisiana in the 1850s who specifically sought women with documented reproductive histories, like the one the Increase Ledger was building for me, for the explicit purpose of continuing to profit from that history on their own properties. I had heard these men discussed by name in conversations among the household staff who served at dinners where such men were guests, conversations conducted in the careful, quiet way that information about danger was always conducted among us. I knew their names. I knew which of them had reputations, among the enslaved communities of several counties, for the specific kind of property they sought and the specific conditions under which the women they purchased lived afterward. The Increase Ledger existed in significant part to make women like me identifiable to men like these and to make our value to them calculable in advance of any sale. I was by age 24 exactly the kind of woman that Ledger was designed to identify. I am not going to describe in detail the conditions under which the entries in that ledger came to be, beyond what I have already said. I am going to describe what I did once I understood what the entries meant for my future, because that is the part of this story that matters, and because dwelling further on the other part serves no purpose except to repeat in different words what the ledger itself already says with brutal and sufficient clarity. What I did was this. I spent 2 years learning everything about how the ledger was used, who consulted it, when, and for what purposes. And then, having learned all of it, I went to the man who actually wrote the entries. His name was Joseph. He was 60 years old in 1852 and had been the Calverton Plantation's clerk for 30 years, a position that had been created by Master Edward's father and that Joseph had occupied since he was 30 years old, recording births and deaths and crop yields and purchases and sales and every other piece of plantation business that required writing, under Master Edward's general direction, but without close day-to-day supervision of every entry, because close supervision would have required Master Edward to do work that he had specifically arranged decades earlier never to have to do. Joseph had taught himself to write through a process that he described to me years later, as similar to mine but harder, because where I had Phyllis to guide me, Joseph had taught himself almost entirely alone, working from fragments, from labels on goods that came to the plantation, from the shapes of letters he observed on documents he was given to carry but not to read, piecing together an understanding of written language across more years than I had been alive when he finally told me the story. He had been the plantation's clerk for 30 years by the time I approached him, which meant he had written in his own hand the entries that had governed the sales of more people than either of us could easily count, including, though I did not know this when I first approached him, his own children. I did not approach Joseph carelessly. I had spent 2 years observing him, the way I observed everything, before I decided that what I was considering was something he might be willing to help with. I had watched him, over those 2 years, in the moments when he believed no one of consequence was watching. I had seen in small things the specific quality of a man carrying something heavy and carrying it for a very long time, the way he sometimes paused, pen in hand, over an entry, for longer than the entry itself seemed to require. The way he occasionally, on certain anniversaries that I eventually understood were the dates of specific sales recorded decades earlier, in his own hand, did not eat his evening meal. Joseph had children of his own who had been sold away from the Calverton plantation over the decades, sold according to the same kind of calculations that the increased ledger existed to produce, sold in transactions that Joseph himself had recorded in his own careful handwriting, at Master Edward's father's direction, decades before Master Edward inherited the property and decades before I was born. By 1852, Joseph had outlived 2 of those children. Information he had received the way such information traveled, slowly, through the networks that connected enslaved communities across counties and states, arriving years after the fact, often arriving as the only acknowledgement that a person's life and death had occurred at all. I went to Joseph in the spring of 1850, when I was 22 years old and had borne 4 children, and the ledger's calculation of my value had reached a level that I understood, from things I had overheard and pieced together over the preceding months, was approaching the threshold at which Master Edward typically began responding to inquiries from buyers, rather than simply receiving them and setting them aside. I told him what I had read in the ledger 18 years old, in the moments when Master Edward's study had been unlocked, and what I had continued to understand about it in the years since, and what I believed it meant for my future and the futures of my children, 3 of whom were still young enough in 1850 to be sold separately from me if Master Edward chose to do so, which the ledger's calculations made, with each passing year, increasingly likely. Joseph was quiet for a long time after I told him this. We were in the small room off the main house kitchen where the ledgers and account books were kept, a room I had legitimate reasons to be in for cleaning purposes, which was part of why I had chosen this moment and this place. Joseph sat at the small writing desk, where he did most of his work, and he looked at the desk, not at me, for long enough that I began to wonder if I had misjudged him entirely, if 2 years of observation had told me less than I believed it had. Then he said, "What do you want me to do?" I told him, what I wanted was simple in concept and complicated in execution. I wanted the ledger to say something different from what was true. Specifically, I wanted it to understate certain things and overstate others in ways calculated to produce a specific effect on how Master Edward and any potential buyers who might eventually see the relevant entries would assess me and my children. An effect that would reduce the likelihood of the kind of sale I was most afraid of, and increase the likelihood of outcomes that were, relatively speaking, within the very narrow range of outcomes available to me, less catastrophic. The most catastrophic outcome, the one the ledger's trajectory was pointing toward with increasing clarity each year, was a sale to a buyer specifically seeking a woman with my documented history, for the purpose I have described, on a property where the same calculations would simply continue, where my remaining children would likely be sold separately as they aged into salability, and where any future children I bore would be subject to the same ledger-keeping that had governed my entire life and the lives of every woman whose name appeared in that book. What I wanted instead, to the extent that wanting anything was possible within a system that gave me no formal power over any part of it, was for the ledger to make me look like something other than what the most predatory category of buyer was specifically seeking. I wanted my documented health, which had in reality been consistently good, to appear less robust than it actually was. I wanted the survival rates of my children, which had been by the standards of the time and place unusually good, to be recorded less favorably. I wanted, in short, the specific number that represented my value for this specific purpose to be lower than it actually was, even as my overall value as a worker and as a person with other recognized skills, including domestic skills that Master Edward valued for reasons separate from the increase ledger, remained accurately recorded. My hope was that if a sale occurred for whatever reason, it would be a sale to a different kind of buyer, for different reasons, under different terms that did not specifically depend on the calculations the increase ledger existed to produce. Joseph understood immediately what I was asking, and he understood immediately, with 30 years of experience to draw on, exactly what the risk was. If the falsified entries were ever discovered through some comparison with other records, or through a buyer's own examination during a sale that revealed a discrepancy between the ledger's account and the physical reality it was supposed to describe, the consequences would fall first and most severely on Joseph, as the clerk whose handwriting filled every page, and Joseph had 30 years of direct observation of what consequences of that kind looked like on the Calverton plantation. He agreed anyway. He told me years afterward, long after emancipation, when we were both old and the danger of speaking about any of it had passed, why he had agreed. He said that his own children had been sold according to entries he had written accurately, at a time in his life when he had not yet understood that accuracy was a choice, that the numbers he recorded were not simply true or false in some neutral sense, but were instruments, tools that produced effects in the world, and that an instrument, once you understood it well enough, could sometimes be used differently than the people who relied on it assumed it would be used. He said also, and this is something I have thought about many times in the years since, that he had spent 30 years writing down the consequences of decisions he had no part in making, and that what I was asking him to do was the first time in 30 years that anyone had asked him to use what he knew, rather than simply record what others decided. Over the following 2 years, Joseph made a series of small adjustments to the increase ledger's entries regarding me and my children. I want to describe some of these adjustments specifically, because the specificity matters. It is the difference between a story about resistance in the abstract and an account of what two people with very limited tools and very limited time and an enormous amount at stake actually did. The first adjustment concerned the birth of my fourth child in 1848. In reality, the birth had been uncomplicated, and my recovery had been rapid, a fact that, recorded accurately, would have been read by any buyer consulting the ledger as evidence of exactly the kind of reliable constitution that the most predatory buyers sought. Joseph's entry instead noted a recovery period longer than what had actually occurred, attributed to what the entry described in the clinical language such entries used as a weakness following the birth that required several additional weeks before normal duties could be resumed. This was not a large change. It was a difference of a few weeks, recorded in an entry that no one but Joseph and Master Edward, and eventually any buyer who examined the book closely, would ever read. But it was the kind of detail that, in the specific calculations such buyers made, mattered. The second adjustment concerned my fifth child, Esther, born in 1850. Esther had been, in reality, a robust infant from birth, the kind of child whose early health a buyer would read as a positive indicator. Joseph's entry described Esther's early weeks using language that suggested a more fragile constitution. Language drawn, Joseph told me later, from entries he had written decades earlier about other children whose early health genuinely had been precarious, language he knew would read. To anyone familiar with how such entries were typically written as a note of caution rather than alarm, but a note nonetheless. The third adjustment was different in kind from the first two. It did not concern a birth at all, but rather a notation Master Edward had begun making in the months before I approached Joseph about my temperament, a notation that used language suggesting I was, in the terminology such notations used, difficult to manage, a characterization that Master Edward had begun applying after I had, on two occasions that I will not describe in detail, refused certain demands in ways that had required him to involve the overseer. Joseph's adjustment to this notation did not remove it, because removing an entry that Master Edward himself had dictated would have been immediately noticeable. Instead, Joseph expanded it, adding additional detail that framed the same underlying facts in a way that, to a buyer specifically weighing the calculations the increased ledger existed to support, read less as evidence of defiance, which some buyers might have found appealing for reasons of their own, and more as evidence of a kind of nervous constitution that the most predatory buyers, who wanted above all reliability and predictability, would weigh as a negative. I want to be clear about what these adjustments did and did not accomplish, because I do not want to overstate any of it. They did not free me. They did not free my children. They did not change the fundamental fact of our enslavement or the fundamental injustice of the system that the increased ledger served, a system that continued to operate, in all its essential features, exactly as it had operated before Joseph ever picked up his pen on my behalf. What the adjustments did was alter, within the extremely narrow range of outcomes available within that system, which specific injustice we were likely to experience, and from which direction it was likely to come. In 1852, Master Edward Calverton received an inquiry regarding me from a buyer in Louisiana, a man named Thibodeau, who operated a sugar plantation in the parishes south of Baton Rouge, and who had, through correspondence that I never saw, but that Joseph described to me afterward, specifically inquired about women with strong documented reproductive histories, the exact category of buyer I had spent 2 years working, through Joseph, to make myself appear less suited for. The increased ledger, by 1852, recorded a history that was technically accurate in its broad strokes, the names, the dates, the basic facts of 5 births, but that emphasized, in its specific details, exactly the kind of complications and uncertainties that a buyer like Thibodeau would weigh against my otherwise high overall valuation. Master Edward, consulting the ledger before responding to Thibodeau's inquiry, a process Joseph witnessed because Master Edward called him into the study to confirm certain details, saw a record that suggested I might not be the reliable long-term asset for this specific purpose that my overall numbers, considered without the specific adjustments, would have suggested. He declined the inquiry. Joseph told me this the same evening, in the small room off the kitchen, in a voice so quiet I had to lean close to hear him. I do not know, and have never known exactly what calculations went through Master Edward's mind when he made that decision, whether the ledger's entries were decisive on their own or simply one factor among several, whether Master Edward gave the matter extensive thought or made the decision quickly and moved on to other business, as men in his position did with decisions that, to them, were entirely ordinary. I know only the outcome, which was that I was not sold to Thibodeau in 1852, and that the specific future that sale would have produced for me and for my children did not happen. This was not a victory in any sense that the word normally carries, and I want to resist even now, even at 60 years old, with decades to have made peace with it, any framing that suggests it was. I remained enslaved. My children remained enslaved. The Calverton plantation continued to operate according to the same fundamental logic that had produced the increased ledger in the first place, a logic that did not care in any sense about the specific adjustments Joseph and I had made, because the logic itself was never disrupted, only in this one instance redirected. What had changed was narrow and specific. A particular sale to a particular buyer for a particular purpose did not occur, and it did not occur because a woman who had been reduced, in the official records of the institution that owned her, to a number representing her reproductive value, had found a way, working through someone she had spent 2 years learning to trust, to make that number say something other than what it would otherwise have said. I continued this work, For the remainder of my time at Calverton, Joseph and I, working together over the following years, made similar adjustments whenever the ledger's trajectory seemed to be approaching another threshold that concerned me, or as I came to understand more of the ledger's broader contents over time, concerned other women on the property, whose situations I could observe and whose entries Joseph and I discussed carefully in the small increments of time we had available, increments that never amounted to more than a few minutes at a stretch, conversations conducted while Joseph appeared to be instructing me in some household task, or while I appeared to be cleaning the room where he worked. Not every adjustment prevented a specific outcome. Some adjustments simply changed the terms of outcomes that occurred anyway, which is itself a thing worth describing, because the difference between a sale's terms can be the difference between a family separated by 100 miles and a family separated by 1,000, between a sale that includes some acknowledgement of family relationships, however minimal, and a sale that includes none. Joseph told me once that in the years before I approached him, every entry he wrote was written without any thought toward how it might be used, because it had never occurred to him that the entries could be written with that thought in mind. After 1850, he told me, he never wrote another entry without thinking about it. I want to tell you about my children now, because the entire point of everything I have described was them, and because what happened to them is the actual measure of whether any of it mattered, more than any abstract assessment of the work Joseph and I did ever could be. Ruth, my eldest, born in 1844, remained on the Calverton plantation until emancipation. She was 21 years old in 1865. In the years before emancipation, Ruth worked primarily in the kitchen alongside Phyllis, who lived to see Ruth grow into adulthood and who, I believe, though she never said so directly, recognized in Ruth something of what she had once recognized in me, because in the final years before the war, Phyllis began teaching Ruth to read in the same root cellar, in the same careful way, using a primer that by then had passed through 4 people whose marks filled its margins. Ruth married a man from a neighboring plantation in 1867, 2 years after emancipation, and raised her own children in freedom in Adams County. Ruth's descendants still live in Mississippi. One of my great-granddaughters, Ruth's descendant, is a school teacher in Natchez, and she has told me that she sometimes thinks about the fact that she teaches reading for a living openly, in a classroom, to children for whom literacy is simply an expectation rather than a danger, and that she thinks about this because of what I told her many years ago, about Phyllis and the root cellar and the primer with all its accumulated marks. My second child, a son named Daniel, was sold in 1853, the year after the Thibodeau inquiry was declined. I want to be honest that this sale happened despite everything Joseph and I had done, because the system did not stop operating, simply because we had influenced one decision regarding one inquiry. Master Edward, in 1853, faced debts related to a poor cotton harvest the previous year, debts that required him to raise money through sales that were, in the language used at the time, necessary regardless of other considerations. Daniel, who was 7 years old in 1853, was among several enslaved people sold that year to cover these debts. What I can tell you is that the terms of Daniel's sale, as recorded in the Calverton accounts in an entry that Joseph also wrote, specified that Daniel was sold individually as a young child with no documented family connections noted in the record, a specific framing that Joseph ensured was present, and that this framing meant Daniel was not marketed or sold as part of any larger transaction involving multiple family members, a common practice in cases of debt-driven sales that often resulted in entire family groups being sold together to a single buyer, specifically because the buyer wanted laborers who would, in the language of the time, settle more easily due to the presence of family, a phrase that meant, in practice, that the family relationships themselves were treated as a tool for ensuring compliance on the new property. By ensuring Daniel's record showed no documented family connections, Joseph ensured that Daniel was not used in this way, that his sale was a transaction involving one child, rather than a transaction involving an entire family unit transferred together to conditions that none of us could have anticipated or influenced in any way. I do not know if this distinction made any difference to what actually happened to Daniel after 1853. I do not know what became of him. I searched for him for years after emancipation, through every channel that existed for such searches in the years immediately following the war, channels that were limited and unreliable, and that connected, at best, a small fraction of the families separated by sales to any information about what had become of the people who'd been sold. I never found him. This is the largest grief of my life, and I do not pretend that anything Joseph and I did changed that grief or made it in any sense bearable. I tell you about Daniel because I will not tell this story in a way that suggests everything worked out, that careful resistance produces clean outcomes, that a system as vast and as brutal as the one that governed my life could be outmaneuvered in any meaningful sense by two people with a pen and a book and 2 years of careful trust building. It cannot. Daniel is the cost. I carry him with me every day of my life, and I will carry him until I die, and I have told my other children and my grandchildren about him, so that he is remembered, even though I do not know where he is or what became of him, or whether he lived to be an old man somewhere, the way I have with his own children and grandchildren, who do not know that a woman in Natchez, Mississippi, spent 60 years thinking about him. My third child, a daughter named Mary, was born in 1846 and remained at Calverton until emancipation. Mary's entry in the increase ledger, the one recording her birth, was among the first that Joseph adjusted in 1850 as part of the same set of changes that affected the entries regarding Esther's birth 4 years later. Mary married in 1866 and lived in Adams County until her death in 1891 at age 45. I live now, near Mary's surviving children, in the small house I mentioned, and it is Mary's family who have, in their own way, made the last years of my life comfortable in ways that I did not expect to have, growing up as I did, to be possible for me. My fourth child, the one whose recovery period Joseph extended in the ledger beyond what had actually occurred, was a son named Isaac, born in 1848. Isaac remained at Calverton until emancipation. After the war, Isaac, who had learned to read as a young man through the same network that had taught Ruth, Phyllis's network, which by then extended further than I think even Phyllis fully realized, became a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was ordained in 1872 and served congregations in Mississippi for over 20 years before relocating to Arkansas, where he served additional congregations until his death in 1903 at age 55. Isaac wrote to me regularly throughout his life, letters that I still have kept in a small box, letters in which he often described his work in terms that, reading them now, I recognize as drawing on something he must have absorbed from me, though he was too young when I was doing the work with Joseph to have any direct memory of it, a way of thinking about patience, about working carefully within constraints, about the difference between what a situation appears to allow and what it actually allows if examined closely enough. My fifth child, Esther, whose early health Joseph recorded as more fragile than it actually was born in 1850 and remained at Calverton until emancipation. After the war, Esther became a teacher, working in the freedmen's schools that were established across Mississippi during Reconstruction, institutions that, for the first time in the history of the state, provided formal education to black children and adults on any meaningful scale. Esther taught in Adams County for over 20 years, in schools that, in their early years, operated under conditions of real danger, as did everyone associated with them. Danger from groups that organized specifically to oppose black education and that did not hesitate to act on that opposition. Esther continued teaching through all of it, and she told me many times over the years that she thought of her work as continuing something, though when she said this, she meant it in a general sense, referring to the broader history of people risking themselves for the sake of literacy rather than knowing the specific details of what her own birth record, written in Joseph's hand in 1850, had been used for. 4 of my 5 children survived to freedom and lived full lives in freedom. One did not in the sense that I never learned what became of him, though I have no reason to believe he did not also survive somewhere, under some name, in some place, living a life I know nothing about. I have made my peace, to whatever extent peace is possible, with not knowing, though I want to be honest, that the word peace is doing more work in that sentence than it perhaps deserves. I have thought over the 60 years of my life about what the men who wrote that word in the ledger, Breeder, understood about what they were describing. I do not believe they understood anything in the sense of understanding that matters. I believe the word existed in their vocabulary the way words exist in any specialized vocabulary, as a tool for a specific purpose, stripped of the human reality it was supposedly describing. They wrote the word and calculated the number and made their decisions based on the number. And the number was, to them, simply information, a fact about an asset, no different in kind from a notation about a mule's breeding history or a field's yield per acre. And I do not say this to suggest that their lack of understanding made what they did less serious. I say it because understanding the specific quality of their lack of understanding, the way it functioned, the way it allowed men to make decisions of enormous consequence, while experiencing those decisions as routine, mundane, a matter of simple arithmetic, is part of understanding how the entire system operated and how it was able to operate for as long as it did. What they did not understand, what the entire system was built on not understanding, was that the women the ledgers described were not simply the subjects of those ledgers. We were, in the cases where literacy and trust and patience and a particular kind of courage aligned also, to whatever limited extent the system's own blind spots permitted, the editors of them, working through intermediaries, in small, careful increments over years, to make the numbers say something other than the whole truth, because the whole truth recorded faithfully and used as intended would have cost us things that we were not willing to simply accept as inevitable, even though accepting things as inevitable was, in nearly every other respect, the condition of our entire existence. I was freed in 1865. I was 37 years old. Joseph was freed the same year at age 73, having spent 43 years as the Calverton plantation's clerk, the last 15 of those years also serving, without anyone besides me ever knowing it, in a capacity that had no name, and that Joseph himself, when I asked him once what he thought of it, said he had never found a word for, except to say that for 15 years he had used the same pen, the same ink, the same handwriting that had recorded the sale of his own children decades earlier, to do something different, and that the difference, even though it was small, even though it had not been enough to bring Daniel back or to change the fundamental nature of what either of us had lived through, had mattered to him in a way he found difficult to describe because it had given him in the final years of his life as an enslaved man something he had not had in all the decades before, which was the sense that the work of his own hands, the specific physical work of writing, belonged in some small part to himself. Joseph died in 1870, 5 years after emancipation, at his home in Adams County, surrounded by the children and grandchildren who had survived, the ones whose lives had not been governed by entries written in his own hand decades earlier. In whatever incomplete and imperfect ways, survival had been possible within a system designed, in every particular, to make survival as a family as difficult as it could be made. I am 60 years old now. I live in Natchez in a small house near Mary's family. I have grandchildren and great-grandchildren. 4 of my 5 children survived to see freedom, and 3 of those 4 lived to see their own children grow up free, and several of those grandchildren are, as I write this, attending schools that did not exist when I was born, learning to read from books that no one has to hide, in rooms where literacy is not a danger, but simply a fact of ordinary life, a fact so ordinary that most of them will never think to wonder what it would mean for it to be otherwise. I think about the increased ledger sometimes. I do not know what became of it. It may have been destroyed, as many plantation records were in the chaos of the war and its aftermath. When the Calverton family, like many planter families in Adams County, lost most of what they had owned, including eventually the plantation itself, which was sold in 1873 to satisfy debts that had accumulated through the war years and after, debts of a kind that 20 years earlier the increased ledger had existed to help prevent by ensuring that women like me could always be converted, when necessary, into money. The book may exist somewhere still, in an archive or a private collection, a leather-bound volume recording names and dates and calculations of value, the specific cold language of a system that reduced human beings to numbers, representing their usefulness for the most fundamental purposes a human being can serve. If it exists, I hope someone reads it someday and understands what it actually was. Not just a record of cruelty, though it was that, and I will not pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier story. But also in its small adjusted entries from the years between 1850 and 1865, entries that look to any casual reader, exactly like every other entry in the book, a record of something else. A record of a woman and an old man working in the only way available to them, with the only tools available to them. A pen, ink, and 30 years of accumulated trust in how the world around them actually operated, to make a system that was designed to consume them say something other than the whole truth about what it was consuming. They called me a breeder. They wrote a number beside my name, and they used that number to make decisions about my life and the lives of my children, decisions I had no formal voice in and no formal right to contest. What they did not write down, because they never knew it was happening, was that the number itself, the very thing they trusted most completely because it seemed so objective, so simply factual, a column in a ledger, was being shaped in small and careful ways over years by the person it was supposedly describing, working through the one other person on the property who understood, as well as I did, exactly what that column of numbers was for. That is the secret. Not that I was extraordinary in any way the word fertile suggests, a framing I have always found, even now, difficult to hear without a kind of cold anger that 60 years has not entirely worn away. But that the most ordinary instrument of the system that owned me, a ledger, a column of numbers, an old man's careful handwriting, could be turned slowly and patiently and at enormous and continuing risk into something other than what it was designed to be, by two people who never, in all the years they worked together, spoke of what they were doing in any terms other than the careful, indirect language that survival required, and who never, as far as I know, told anyone else what they had done until I am telling it now, 60 years old, in a small house in Natchez, to whoever is listening. I do not know if what Joseph and I did changed enough. Daniel is gone, and I will never know what became of him, and no adjustment to any ledger can change that, and I will not let this account end in a way that suggests otherwise. But 4 of my 5 children lived to see freedom, and lived full lives after, and I believe, as much as I am able to believe anything about a system that was designed, in every detail, to prevent exactly this kind of belief from having any basis, that the adjustments mattered, that they were not nothing, that a woman who could read, and an old man who could write, and 2 years of careful, patient, dangerous work, and 15 years of continuing it after that, changed something about what happened to a family in Adams County, Mississippi, in the years between 1850 and 1865. That is what I have to tell. That is the whole of it.
This account is presented as a first-person historical narrative, reflecting documented practices of the antebellum cotton and sugar economies, including the maintenance of plantation records, valuing enslaved women according to childbearing history, a practice extensively documented by historians of American slavery and referenced in numerous first-hand accounts collected from formerly enslaved people in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The specific individuals and the Calverton plantation described in this account are composite representations used to illustrate documented historical patterns, in keeping with the historical fiction format of this series, rather than records of specific named individuals or a specific real property. The practice of enslaved clerks maintaining plantation records, the self-education of literacy among enslaved people through informal networks, often centered on individual teachers and shared materials passed across generations, and documented instances in which such individuals used their position to influence outcomes for enslaved people in small but meaningful ways, are all reflected in the historical scholarship on literacy and resistance during the slavery era, including in the Works Progress Administration's collection of formerly enslaved people's narratives recorded in the 1930s, which preserved first-hand accounts of similar dynamics on plantations throughout the South, and in subsequent academic studies of plantation record keeping and its role in the economic structure of American slavery. If this story moved you, if you believe that even within the most dehumanizing systems people found ways to exercise agency, however limited, and that those small acts of resistance and their costs deserve to be remembered alongside the larger history of slavery, subscribe now and join us as we continue exploring these difficult but essential histories. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what stayed with you most. Subscribe, comment, and share so these stories continue to be told.